This conference will now be recorded.
So I'd like to welcome everybody and thank you for joining me today on June 18th, 2020 for a presentation about Elder Abuse Awareness Month and how working together we can stop it from happening and make Florida a safe place for everybody to live. So I'm going to start with some statistics because I feel that this is really important to appreciate and comprehend what the older population is and is going to be in the next 20 years here in Florida, as well as in the United States. The Census Bureau has reported that the population that is over age 65 is going to reach the level of 80 million people by the year 2040, and those who will surpass age 85 is going to increase to 14 million by 2040. So these numbers tell us that this is a serious issue we're dealing with, as well as other states across the nation. And we're going to see more and more cases being reported. And if anything, that's going to help us better assess and identify what the warning factors are so we can do our best in the community to prevent the abuse, neglect, and exploitation from actually happening. So there is a saying that says, if we don't learn from the past, we're doomed to repeat that history. And my hope is that if you walk away with nothing else today, it's that you'll have some factors to share with your colleagues, your neighbors, your family, which will make everybody more aware and alert, and we won't just ignore the warning signs. So I want to share with you a story about the Havens family. The senior Mrs. Havens, Dorothy, was having her daughter Catherine and her granddaughter Amanda living with her towards 2014 into 2015. And the reason they moved in was twofold. Number one, Catherine and her daughter Amanda were finding it hard to make ends meet on their own. And number two, Dorothy was starting to fail physically as well as cognitively. And she needed assistance in the house in order to be safe and taken care of. Unfortunately, when Dorothy was found by her county's caseworkers and 911, she was in a very bad condition. She had sepsis. She had open wounds on her body that had been there for some period of time and were not being treated. And the day after she was removed from her home to a hospital, she passed away. Her daughter and her granddaughter were charged with elder abuse, and the daughter was charged with second-degree murder of her mom. Both the daughter and the granddaughter were found guilty. The granddaughter was sentenced to approximately 15 years in jail, and Catherine received a sentence of 15 years to life. When I first read about this case, I was just horrified because when they interviewed Catherine as to what was actually going on in the house and why didn't she get help, why didn't she reach out, the answer she gave was just alarming. She said, I had thought about applying for Medicaid to get assistance to help us, but I thought that if we applied, that my mother, who owned the home, would lose the home, which meant that my daughter and I would be living out on the street and we would have no place. So because of her misunderstanding, she never reached out to get proper legal advice from an elder law attorney. And that misconception cost Dorothy her life. So before we can understand the profile of a perpetrator or the profile of a potential victim, we need to first understand, what does Florida law say is a vulnerable adult? Who is the person that we want to protect? So we have two definitions in Florida. The first defines an elderly person, and that is somebody who is 60 years of age or older. They are suffering from the infirmities of aging, just through the normal aging process. Maybe it's difficult for them to get around. It's difficult for them to do things we at a younger age take for granted: food shopping, meal preparation, being able to do our own laundry. Or they're somehow impaired in their ability to provide for their own care and protection. Maybe they're not properly monitoring their medications. They're not able to call the doctor and say, I need a checkup. I'm not sure that the medication is working. So anybody that has these facts is going to qualify as an elderly person. Now, what about somebody who's younger than age 60? And that leads us to the second definition, which is, who is a disabled adult? This is somebody who is age 18 or older, because 18 is the time frame when we become adults in Florida. They may have a developmental disability, which means a disability from birth, such as autism, spina bifida, cerebral palsy, and others. It could be that there is organic brain damage. Perhaps they were involved in a very bad accident that injured the brain. It can even include an adult who has a diagnosis of a mental illness. That could be schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, or any kind of physical or mental limitation that affects their ability to perform normal activities of daily living. So these are things such as our ability to feed ourselves, to bathe, to toilet, to transfer from a bed to a chair. We call those activities of daily living. Now, if somebody falls within the category of being an elderly person or a disabled adult, then they are going to qualify as somebody who is a vulnerable adult. And that's who Florida laws are intended to protect: people that are our most vulnerable population. Now, it's important for us to see in our mind's eye what might contribute to somebody becoming a victim. And for this, we really have to take ourselves out of our own skin to truly understand who are the people that perpetrators are going to prey upon. So the first factor that the National Organization Against Elder Abuse has found in its surveys is that there's a lack of social network, lack of people that are going to be watching out for this vulnerable adult. So it could very well mean that somebody is unmarried, either because they were once married and now the spouse has died, or perhaps they're divorced, or they never married. The second most common factor is that the individual has some level of cognitive impairment, which means it could be affecting their ability to exercise good judgment as to who they talk to, who they befriend. It can also mean that cognitive impairment is affecting their ability to communicate properly or effectively. And so they don't think to share information about somebody new who's in their home with a relative who's living in another state. So cognitive impairment is a major factor that identifies people who are more likely to become a victim. The third most common factor is functional impairment, meaning maybe I don't remember now how to use a phone because of my impairment, or I'm not sure where the bank is, how to get to the bank, or I'm just in poor health, and so because I don't feel well, that's affecting my ability to concentrate and reason and use good judgment skills. The surveys have found that there is a disparity between women and men, that women are more likely to be abused and to be victims. And as you can imagine from the definition we looked at for a disabled adult, people with disabilities are very high on the list of becoming victims. You know, I remember when my daughter was in preschool, she was about 2 or 3 years old, and my husband and I were trying to find ways on her level to explain to her who a stranger is and why not to talk with a stranger or ever go with a stranger. And I think back to that time in this webinar simply because the vision we had of somebody who was a stranger who might harm her can actually be the opposite of what these people are really like in real life. And again, the surveys show us that many incidences of elder abuse and exploitation are actually perpetrated by family members of the victim. The next most common category are friends and neighbors of the victim. The third most common category are paid caregivers coming into the home. That might be people coming in through a registry or a home health agency or somebody that the victim found and is paying them off the table. The surveys also show that men have a higher tendency to commit elder abuse and exploitation, and that these perpetrators most likely have prior criminal acts that they've committed. They may have a substance abuse addiction or financial problems, such as being unemployed, that seem to lead them on this path of taking advantage of others. So I'd like to pause here and share a story with you about a guardianship matter I handled about 2 years ago, just to put into perspective the commonalities between who's more likely to be a victim as well as who's likely to be a perpetrator. We received a call from an out-of-state niece of an older adult residing here in Broward County. And she was coming to Florida. She was very concerned because her uncle had died in March. She was calling us in June. And her aunt just didn't sound right on the phone. And her aunt was also telling her that she was afraid of the neighbors. When the niece arrived here in Florida, she first noticed that her aunt had lost a great amount of weight and she was very thin. The aunt also told her that the neighbor's children, an adult daughter and son, had the key to her house and she was very fearful of them coming in. But she had trouble explaining in detail why she was afraid. What the niece eventually learned over the next few days during her visit was that right after her uncle passed away in the second week of March, these neighbors took the aunt to a criminal lawyer in Fort Lauderdale who prepared a durable power of attorney naming the neighbor as her financial decision maker. They had the lawyer prepare a new will, which completely left out the aunt's only surviving sibling who lived in Australia. And they had the lawyer prepare a new deed, and the aunt conveyed her ownership of her home to these neighbors and received absolutely no monetary value in exchange. And the house was worth about $350,000 to $400,000. Well, when we realized what was going on, we filed for an emergency temporary guardianship to protect the older adult from further financial exploitation and also to keep her physically safe. Now, as I got to know the older adult more over the next few months, what I learned was that she and her husband had lived in this neighborhood for almost 40 years. and had what she thought was a good relationship with the neighbors who lived across the street. She even said to me, Stephanie, I don't understand why they would do this. I used to babysit them when their parents were working, and one time when their parents couldn't pay the electric bill or couldn't pay other utility bills, my husband and I gave them the money to be able to do that. Why did they do this to me? What I learned that really led up to her becoming a victim was that she was showing signs of cognitive decline at least a year before. She was getting lost when she was driving in the car. And the husband was cognitively intact. However, he was declining physically. So when the neighbor's children saw this, they probably realized it was a very vulnerable situation and unfortunately an ideal situation for these neighbors to take advantage of. The good news is that we were able to stop everything. We were able to get the house back, most of the money, and she now has a guardian who's been appointed by the court to take care of her needs, to watch over her assets. But the fact that she had to endure this right after her husband died and to be taken advantage of is something that we should not allow any human being to experience. So let's talk now about what are the characteristics of abuse. What should you be looking for? What should you be listening for? So that you know the signs, you know what to do next to report and protect the older adult. Well, the one that probably comes to most people's minds is physical abuse, meaning that the perpetrator would actually strike, physically strike, or injure either an older adult or a person with a disability. Now, in our last slide, you saw a picture of an older adult sitting on a couch and the perpetrator yelling and flailing their hand in front of them. That's going to fall under the category of mental or emotional abuse, where somebody is being told, if you don't do what I'm telling you, I'm going to leave and there's not going to be anybody here to take care of you. You're going to be all alone. So don't ever forget that there's this type of abuse which preys upon the fact that the older adult feels less strong, less in control because of either their physical condition, the fact that they may have lost a spouse recently, or that there's nobody else nearby locally to help them. And the last characteristic that's most important about abuse is that it is an intentional act. This is something that is thought about. It's not neglect. It's actually intentional. So these are signs we don't want to ignore. You know, even if you say, okay, it happened one time, but when you see it happen a second time, that's the time that we need to speak up and do something about it. Now, neglect can either be self-neglect, meaning the older adult is not paying attention to their nutritional needs. There's rotten food in the refrigerator. They didn't refill their prescriptive medication. The medication vial is empty on the kitchen counter. They're not keeping their medical appointments, or they're not making medical appointments. Or you see that the house is in a very bad condition, which means that their health, safety, and well-being is jeopardized. Alternatively, if there is somebody that has a responsibility to care for the older adult or the adult with the disability, it could be that they're failing to protect that person from harm. And this would be similar to the situation we talked about in the beginning about the Havens not taking care of the grandparent. When they saw the ulcer on the skin, they didn't get medical attention. So these are examples of the warning signs that should alert all of us to when somebody is being neglected, either at their own hands or the hands of somebody else. Now, we're definitely seeing more and more cases of exploitation, especially since the quarantine started the second week of March. And it's not that I think these situations just arose because of the quarantine. I think they existed prior to March 13th, but they are now coming to light because trusted family members are now finding out what is happening. It still is also an ideal situation with the quarantine that unfortunately makes people victims, and people who are perpetrators look at it as an opportunity to take advantage because other people won't be seeing what's happening. So I want to share with you what we all have learned in the last few years about Mickey Rooney, who was a very famous childhood actor in Hollywood. And we didn't learn until maybe a year before he passed away that he himself had become a victim of both physical abuse and financial exploitation at the hands of his last wife and his wife's son, who became his business manager. They were physically abusing him. He was very afraid to speak up. And it wasn't until that some other people in Hollywood realized what was happening that he was actually contacted by several congressmen and asked to come to Washington to testify at a hearing about what he had gone through. The stepson had also abused him by taking advantage of millions of dollars. When he died, he had, I think, about $18,000 left to his name. They were charged and they are now serving time in prison. The reason I share this story is so that everybody understands that abuse, neglect, and exploitation is cutting across all lines of wealth, all lines of diversity, of culture. And as one of the primary factors we discussed a few minutes ago, a lot of the abuse and exploitation is being perpetrated by family, people that are closest to us. So what are we looking for with exploitation? It may be that the person is being deceived. They're being led to believe they're going to get something if they give something in return, or they're being intimidated. And that goes back to the mental and the emotional abuse. They're being intimidated to give up something of value. It could be an account, it could be a car, it could be the house. I think we're also seeing more situations of exploitation where the older adult is being taken to an attorney and they're being instructed by the perpetrator what to write in the will. And the prior will is being completely altered to benefit only the perpetrator and cut out everybody else that ordinarily would have been the natural beneficiaries of the older adult. In my story that I shared with you a few minutes ago, exploitation included that the older adult signed a deed over to the neighbor and gave away hundreds of thousands of dollars, probably her most valuable asset that she and her husband had worked hard to buy. Don't minimize that exploitation also comes in the form of the perpetrator's name being added onto the account, which then as a joint owner gives them complete and unfettered access to take out as much as they want. And we still have telephone scams that are occurring, although today we more often see the email scams where somebody writes, I'm stranded in another country. Can you please help me by sending money? And when I get home, I'm going to repay you. The thing that you want to keep in mind is nobody should ever have to send money to enter a sweepstakes. If that's what it says, it's not a real sweepstakes and it's a scam. So how are we going to combat this? What is it that we as professionals can do? Well, what we can do is continue to educate in our both lay community and professional community, and have strong open lines of communication between different professionals as well as our local authorities. So it's important that we maintain relationships with our local police and sheriff organization. The Florida Department of Elder Affairs has a Florida Elder Abuse Prevention Program, so they are also an active participant in furthering education. There's Adult Protective Services, APS, which falls under the arm of the Department of Children and Families, and we're going to talk about them in just another minute. Always know about other resources. So there's Jewish Family Services, and they do not only serve the Jewish population, they help everybody regardless of religious status. You may need to call upon them for assistance. For those members of our LGBT community, we have SunServe, which is the social service agency for the community. And there are two excellent resources you can find on the internet. I've provided you with their websites. There's the National Center on Elder Abuse, as well as the National Center on Law and Elder Rights. And they have wonderful webinars and communication pieces that can be downloaded and given out to people in the community to raise awareness. So again, don't minimize the role that each one of us can have, because the more people that share the information and further the educational process, that's how we're going to be able to send the message that this type of action is not going to be tolerated in Florida. Now, another arm of intervention that's important is Adult Protective Services, and Florida does have an 800 number for its abuse hotline. So that you'll understand what happens when somebody makes a report, and it can be an anonymous report, is that the report is initially taken in Tallahassee, and then it is given down to the appropriate county where the alleged victim is living. From there, there's going to be an APS investigator assigned to go out and meet with the alleged victim. And by speaking with the alleged victim, one of the first things they have to determine is whether this person is capable of giving consent to receive protective services. So what are protective services? Depending on what the investigator observes, let's say it's that the person does not have food in the refrigerator, or the food in the refrigerator is rotten, it's spoiled. It may mean that they're going to provide food, or they're going to provide a Publix card for food to be purchased. Other protective services might include medical attention, getting the person to a doctor or getting them to a hospital for treatment. It might also mean getting a licensed home health agency into the private setting to provide the kind of services the elder needs to be safe. It might include cooking, meal preparation, light housekeeping. They may need to be watched at night if there's the tendency for them to walk around because perhaps there's cognitive impairment. So first, the investigator is going to determine whether this person can give consent. If the individual is not able to give consent because they're not realizing what is happening to them, then the investigator in their report is going to tell the legal department for DCF, and the legal department is going to file in the court a petition for protective services, which is given an emergency status. So they go into court on an emergency basis very quickly, and there will be an attorney assigned by the court to represent the alleged victim to make sure that they're receiving due process and they're being protected. So if the judge finds that the individual lacks capacity to consent and there's sufficient evidence to justify the provision of protective services, then the judge is going to sign an order authorizing those protective services to be provided. The next thing that the investigator is going to look at is what is the relationship between the victim and the alleged perpetrator? Is it what we call a fiduciary relationship, which means perhaps the perpetrator is the person given authority under a durable power of attorney or under a trust agreement that they may be taking advantage of the status they have under the legal document? Or might it be that the alleged perpetrator has a confidential relationship with the victim? What a confidential relationship is, for example, a family member coming into the home has a relationship. Maybe they're taking advantage of that relationship with the grandparent. Or it might be a home health aide that is coming into the home, and there's a confidential relationship that's developed because the elder is dependent on that perpetrator. Could be for the provision of food, assistance in the bathroom, or other services. So when the investigator sees either a fiduciary or a confidential relationship, that weighs heavily in this reporting process. They're also looking to see, are there facts that suggest that the elder has been deceived by the perpetrator or somehow defrauded to give something up in return for getting nothing? Or was there a misrepresentation made? For example, maybe the perpetrator says, I need you to co-sign a loan for me so I can get a car, but I'm going to pay you back the money. And there's no way they have money to repay the loan. That would be an example of somebody being deceived or a misrepresentation. Now, the investigation process and the report is considered a confidential record. It is only accessible either to a judge, to a state attorney that might be prosecuting. It is available to the victim or a legal representative of the victim. So if the victim ends up having a guardian appointed for them, the guardian can then request a copy of the report, or the attorney for the guardian can request a copy of the report. Florida, in its law, is very specific that healthcare professionals and certain mental health professionals have an obligation, meaning it's mandatory to report when there is suspicion of abuse, neglect, or exploitation taking place. So that would include, for example, a physician who's meeting with their patient. It would include the social worker at a community, whether it's a nursing facility or assisted living facility. And to protect those people, those professionals, and to encourage people to do mandatory reporting, they are immune. They are immune under the law should there be any kind of reprisal, meaning that if their employer intends to demote them or attempts to fire them and discharge them from work, they are protected for having made that report in good faith. So let's talk a little bit about some of the legal tools, because we've talked about what are the factors to look for, what are examples of abuse, neglect, and exploitation, how do you begin the process of intervention, and now we're going to talk about what does the law provide to then protect and stop the abuse and stop further exploitation. So one of the first tools that we want to use is called an emergency temporary guardianship. And this is where we file papers that explain to the court that either somebody is being abused, either self-neglected or neglected by another person that was to be caring for them, or they're being financially exploited. How do we do this? Well, the person that is signing the petition needs to have personal knowledge, meaning they had to observe what was happening. It might be that they saw in the bank account large sums of money disappearing. It might be that they noticed black and blue marks on the individual, on their upper arms because they were being grabbed, or on their face because they were shoved to the floor and they hit the side of their face. That's what we need to allege to show there is a true emergency, and that will get us into court immediately. The court tries to, again, even in emergency situations, make sure that the victim is properly protected. So the judge will appoint an attorney in the community to represent the victim. And their job is to go out and meet with the victim very quickly, gather as much information as they can, and make a recommendation to the judge as to whether this is an emergency situation. If it is, then the judge will order that a guardian be appointed on an emergency basis, which is good for 90 days. And the reason it's 90 days is the thought process is that will be sufficient time to stabilize the situation, keep the person safe, get them the medical attention they need, stop the exploitation from continuing, and it then allows the court to determine whether the victim, with proper medical care and attention, can now make their own decisions, or is there a need for a more permanent guardianship, one that will last indefinitely. So that leads us to the second and the third bullet points of plenary guardianship and limited guardianship. Plenary means full. So in a full guardianship, an individual is determined to be unable either due to physical incapacity or mental incapacity or both, that they're unable to protect themselves. They're unable to handle their financial affairs. Perhaps their bills are going into collection status. Maybe even the electricity is being cut off or the phone service has been disconnected. Whereas a limited guardianship means that the person is still capable of being able to properly make some decisions, but not all decisions. So for example, it may be that the court finds that the individual still has the ability to decide who they want to vote for. So they'll be retaining the right to vote. Maybe they'll retain the right to be involved in determining their social environment, where they're going to live. But the other rights, like financial decision-making or medical decision-making, will be removed and delegated to a guardian. So guardianships address both the physical person as well as the assets, the property, the income of the individual. Now, legal tools do not necessarily work independently of one another. And in emergency situations, especially situations involving exploitation, there's another legal tool we're going to use simultaneously. And this is called an injunction for protection of a vulnerable adult. This actually became law just 1 year ago. So we just had our 1-year anniversary in May. And it's a wonderful tool because not only do we get into court quickly on an emergency basis, but if we have enough facts to establish that exploitation of a vulnerable adult is occurring, we will get an order called an injunction signed by the judge that we can then take to all the banks, all the financial institutions to shut down and freeze the accounts. This stops the perpetrator from continuing to take advantage of the vulnerable adult. We're also allowed to take this injunction and record it in the county records, which means that if the perpetrator attempts to try to sell the house from under the person, they won't be able to do that because this order is recorded. And so it protects the vulnerable adult. So this is a wonderful and a very important tool that we now have in our toolkit. If somebody is being physically, emotionally, or mentally abused, then we would also want to seek a restraining order to prevent that perpetrator for coming anywhere near them or their home, or if it's a younger adult and they're working, to keep them away from their place of employment. And in fact, when I've obtained an injunction, I've even included the restraining order language in the injunction to protect the adult, especially when it might be a spouse or a family member that is committing the abuse and the exploitation. Another wonderful tool that Florida has in the event that the fiduciary named in a durable power of attorney is misusing their authority is we can file what's called a verified statement. So it's almost like an affidavit. It's being signed under oath under penalties of perjury. And if that fiduciary is somebody close, such as an adult child or a spouse, we put in the facts and the allegations as to why we believe this person's authority should be suspended or terminated. And we have a hearing, and the judge can grant an order that suspends or terminates the power of attorney. And again, we would take that order, get it certified, and provide it to all the financial institutions so that there's no possibility of the fiduciary going in and cleaning out the accounts. I'll give you an example. I'm currently handling an incapacity proceeding, which we're going to have the hearing on Monday, for an older adult in her 80s who has a history of a mental health illness. And 7 or so years ago, she gave a durable power of attorney to one of 2 adult children. What we've learned is the adult child did not use the power of attorney, so she's got accounts that have gone into collection. And we've also learned that this adult child has an addiction problem to alcohol as well as substances. And so clearly he is not the best person to be acting in her financial interests. And so we've had the other sibling sign the verified statement with the information that he has personal knowledge of, and that will be heard by the judge. And we strongly believe that the judge is going to feel that there's enough facts for the judge to terminate the authority of the adult child under the durable power of attorney. So again, another great tool for us to use should these situations arise. Now, the victim does have the opportunity to file a civil lawsuit against the perpetrator for breaching their fiduciary duty under a trust document or under a power of attorney. And this is a right in addition to the state attorney being able to bring criminal charges against the perpetrator for abuse, neglect, or exploitation. So we've talked a little bit about things to look for, and I want to just share with you a few more of the red flags that I want you to keep your eyes open for. So again, don't underestimate the ability of people to use email and the internet to prey on people that are going to become their victims. Again, we see a lot of this happening when people have cognitive impairment and they cannot differentiate, nor can they distinguish between somebody who's to be trusted and somebody who's a stranger who's seeking to take advantage of them. There is an 800 number as well as a website for the National Fraud Information Center, so you can also go on their website and continue to be educated and informed. Remember that for contests and sweepstakes, you don't have to register by paying anything. You don't have to register by signing up for a magazine subscription. That's not what a true sweepstakes is about. Always be careful about people coming into the home as aides or caregivers. This is one of the primary reasons why I recommend to my clients that they work with a licensed home health agency who's going to do a background check on the individual. We don't want people going in who have a criminal history, who have a civil history. Perhaps there's already been an APS investigation of them. And the way to find that out is to go through a licensed home health agency. If somebody you know starts talking about how they've decided to change their will or their trust because the aide or the person coming in to help them has been so wonderful and they're going to leave everything to them, the red light should go off. Another thing I want to mention that we've seen in the last 3 months during the quarantine is older men whose wives have passed. They're now becoming victims. They're being preyed on by women who see it as an opportunity to come in and befriend them and become a girlfriend, and then start to ask them for money and gifts, to buy them a car, to buy them a home. And again, they're creating that confidential relationship with the older adult where the adult feels, hey, if I don't do this, they're not going to stay with me. They're not going to help me, and I'm going to be all alone. And I can't do that because I know that I need help to take care of myself. So that's another red flag to watch for. If you hear somebody saying, oh yeah, I signed a deed, but I don't remember what I signed, that's another red flag to listen for. And then of course, visually, you want to observe, how your neighbors look, the people that are members of your church or synagogue. Are they looking frail? Does their clothing look like it hasn't been washed? There are stains on it. If it's a woman, you might notice that the nail polish is half on, half off. Those could be signs of either self-neglect or neglect by a caregiver. So don't ever minimize what you see. And that's why I think it's so important to speak up and say something, because we actually may be saving somebody's life by doing that. So I'd like to open it up now if anybody has any questions about elder abuse or questions about interventions that are available. I'm going to go ahead and unmute everybody. So you're welcome to ask a question, or you're welcome to type it into the chat box.
Stephanie, I want to thank you. It was very good. Your webinar was great. We just recently had a case that was an exploitation case, and hit all of your points that you presented today, and we ended up reaching out to DCF, and they came in and said that our case was founded, and they were going to go with a guardianship on the gentleman, but his attorney did step up, and he had known the gentleman for many years, and ended up doing the healthcare surrogate and power of attorney for him. So it all worked out in the long run, and it turned out in the gentleman's best interest, because he had a woman that he had met a couple of years after his wife had passed away at a restaurant, and he was paying her $7,000 a month just to come in and clean his house, and he had given her 2 cars. So when we found this out, next thing you know, legal documents showed up at the house. She had changed his will. She had become his healthcare surrogate, or was trying to. And we then notified DCF right away, and he was concerned because he did not want this to occur. So everything happened real fast, and DCF stopped everything in the process. So,
Well, I'm glad to hear that had a good ending. He was very fortunate to have your company intervene.
Yes, we were notified immediately and took steps, and, it had an excellent outcome, which some of the cases do not, have that excellent outcome.
You're absolutely right. Thank you for sharing that, Debbie. And I'd like to invite everybody to join me for our next few webinars. Tomorrow at 12:30 on July 19th, we're going to host part 2 of Medical Advance Directives in the Shadows of COVID-19. We're going to be talking about how cultural diversity impacts medical decision-making in the United States. And then next Friday on June 26th at 12:30, I'm going to be speaking about the 5 most common misconceptions about wills and probate so that you know the difference between the myths and the facts. And I invite you to visit my website at www.fl-elderlaw.com to register for the webinars. And thank you for joining me today, and I look forward to the next time you join me and to being your trusted advisor.